The auction block stood empty in the sweltering Georgia heat, but the memory of what had happened there just hours before still lingered in the air like smoke. Victoria Hayes had spent her entire life believing that some people were simply born to serve others. She had inherited 300 slaves along with Magnolia Creek Plantation, and she ruled over them with the cold efficiency her father had taught her. But on this particular morning in 1863, as she watched a young woman named Celeste remove the iron shackles from her own wrists and let them fall to the ground with a hollow clang, Victoria had no idea that everything she thought she knew about power, worth, and human dignity was about to crumble. The woman who had been bought and sold like property would soon become the only person standing between Victoria and complete destruction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Hayes had never questioned her place in the world, and why should she? At 26, she possessed everything that mattered in the society of Savannah, Georgia. Her father, Colonel Benjamin Hayes, had built Magnolia Creek Plantation into one of the most profitable cotton operations in the state before his death 2 years earlier. The main house, with its towering white columns and wraparound porches, commanded a view of 3,000 acres of prime farmland worked by 300 enslaved people who had never known any life beyond the boundaries of the Hayes property. Victoria's morning routine began each day at precisely 6 o'clock, when her personal servant, an elderly woman named Ruth, would bring her coffee and lay out her clothes for the day. Victoria preferred dark colors that reflected her practical nature and the authority she needed to maintain over both her household staff and the field workers who generated her considerable wealth. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, and her gray eyes missed nothing as she conducted her daily inspections of the plantation's operations. The Hayes family had owned Magnolia Creek for 3 generations, building their fortune on the backs of people they considered property rather than human beings. Victoria had been raised to see this arrangement as natural and divinely ordained. Her father had taught her that maintaining proper discipline was essential for both profitability and social order. Weakness or sentimentality toward the enslaved population would lead to reduced productivity, potential uprisings, and the collapse of everything the Hayes family had worked to build. Victoria's education had been conducted by private tutors who reinforced these beliefs while teaching her the skills necessary to manage a large agricultural operation. She could read financial ledgers with the same fluency that other women her age read romance novels. She understood crop rotation, weather patterns, and market fluctuations that determined whether a harvest would generate profit or loss. Most importantly, she had learned to view the 300 people who worked her land as assets to be maximized, rather than individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and sufferings. The slave quarters at Magnolia Creek consisted of 2 rows of wooden cabins that housed entire families in single rooms, barely large enough for sleeping. Victoria made weekly inspections of these dwellings, not out of concern for the inhabitants' comfort, but to ensure that her property was being maintained properly. She had specific rules about cleanliness, noise levels, and behavior that were enforced through a combination of reduced food rations, extended work hours, and physical punishment for those who failed to comply with her expectations. Her overseer, a man named Edmund Thorne, had worked for the Hayes family for 15 years and shared Victoria's views about the necessity of maintaining strict control over the enslaved population. Thorne was a thin, weathered man in his 50s who carried a leather whip and used it frequently to ensure that work quotas were met and discipline was maintained. He reported to Victoria each morning about productivity levels, potential troublemakers, and any incidents that had occurred during the previous day. Victoria trusted Thorne's judgment completely and rarely questioned his methods, as long as the plantation continued to generate the income she expected. She had inherited not just land and buildings from her father, but also a worldview that saw enslaved people as naturally inferior beings who required constant supervision and control. The idea that these individuals might possess intelligence, dignity, or rights equal to her own had never entered her consciousness as a serious possibility. The social circles in which Victoria moved reinforced these beliefs at every turn. Her neighbors, fellow plantation owners, and the merchants who bought her cotton all shared the assumption that slavery was both economically necessary and morally justified. Sunday services at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church featured sermons that used biblical passages to support the notion that some people were divinely intended to serve others. Victoria's closest friends, other young women from prominent planting families, spent their time planning elaborate parties and discussing which eligible bachelors might make suitable husbands. Victoria herself had received several marriage proposals from the sons of wealthy families, but she had declined them all. Her father had left her in complete control of Magnolia Creek, and she was reluctant to surrender that authority to a husband who might have different ideas about how the plantation should be managed. She took pride in her ability to succeed in what was generally considered a man's world, though she never questioned the fundamental assumptions that made her success possible. The war that had been raging for 2 years seemed distant and abstract from the perspective of Magnolia Creek. Victoria was aware that Union forces were operating in various parts of the South, but Georgia had been largely spared from major military campaigns. The plantation continued to produce cotton that found its way to market through blockade runners, and the profits remained substantial enough to maintain Victoria's comfortable lifestyle. She had convinced herself that the conflict would eventually end with Southern independence and a return to the normal order of things. The enslaved people at Magnolia Creek were also aware of the war, though they understood its implications very differently than their owner did. Whispered conversations in the slave quarters spoke of Union armies that were liberating plantations throughout the region. Songs that seemed to be about biblical themes actually contained coded messages about escape routes and safe havens. Victoria noticed that productivity had declined slightly in recent months, but she attributed this to laziness rather than the growing hope that freedom might actually be possible. On this particular morning, Victoria was preparing for what she considered a routine transaction. A slave trader named Harold Wickham had arrived the previous evening with a small group of people he was looking to sell. One of Victoria's field hands had died from fever the week before, and she needed to replace his labor to maintain her cotton production levels. The auction would take place in the courtyard behind the main house, where Victoria could examine the available workers and make her selection based on their apparent strength, health, and likely productivity. Wickham was a coarse man in his 40s who made his living by buying enslaved people in one location and transporting them to areas where demand was higher. He traveled with a wagon designed to hold his human cargo in cramped, uncomfortable conditions that reflected his view of them as mere merchandise. Victoria found Wickham personally distasteful, but she appreciated his willingness to provide the labor she needed without asking questions about her treatment of her existing workforce. The group that Wickham had brought to Magnolia Creek consisted of 6 people, ranging in age from 16 to 40. They had been traveling for 3 weeks in the back of his wagon, fed minimal amounts of food and water while being transported from a failed plantation in South Carolina. Victoria examined each of them with the calculating gaze she would use to evaluate livestock, checking their teeth, muscles, and general health to determine their potential value as workers. 5 of the 6 appeared to be typical field hands who could be put to work immediately picking cotton or performing other manual labor. The 6th person, however, was different in ways that Victoria found both intriguing and troubling. She was a young woman, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her while revealing nothing of her own thoughts. Her name, according to Wickham's papers, was Celeste, and she had apparently been working as a house servant before her previous owner had sold his property. Celeste stood straighter than the others, despite the obvious hardships of her recent journey. Her clothes were worn and dirty from weeks of travel, but she maintained a dignity that Victoria found unsettling. Most enslaved people who arrived at Magnolia Creek displayed the submissive behavior that Victoria expected, keeping their eyes downcast and speaking only when directly addressed. Celeste met Victoria's gaze steadily, without defiance, but also without the fear that Victoria was accustomed to seeing. During the brief examination that preceded the auction, Victoria noticed other details about Celeste that set her apart from typical field hands. Her hands showed signs of domestic work rather than agricultural labor. She carried herself with the posture of someone who had been educated, though formal schooling for enslaved people was illegal throughout the South. Most intriguingly, when Victoria asked her a direct question about her previous duties, Celeste answered in clear, grammatically correct English that suggested a level of intelligence that Victoria found both useful and potentially dangerous. The auction itself was a brief affair conducted according to the customs that Victoria had observed dozens of times before. Wickham presented each person individually, describing their apparent strengths and previous work experience, while Victoria and Thorne discussed their potential value. The 5 field hands were purchased quickly for standard prices that reflected the current market rates for agricultural labor. Celeste was presented last, and Wickham seemed eager to complete the transaction quickly. He quoted a price that was significantly lower than Victoria had expected, explaining that Celeste had been difficult to manage during the journey and might require additional discipline to become a productive worker. Victoria sensed that there was more to the story than Wickham was revealing, but the reduced price made Celeste an attractive purchase regardless of any potential problems. The moment that would later prove to be the turning point in both women's lives occurred immediately after Victoria completed the purchase. As was customary, Celeste had been wearing iron shackles around her wrists during the auction to prevent any possibility of escape. Wickham approached with the key to remove these restraints, but before he could unlock them, Celeste did something that no one present had ever seen before. She somehow managed to slip her hands free from the shackles without any assistance, letting the heavy iron restraints fall to the ground with a sound that echoed across the courtyard like a bell tolling. The action was performed with such fluid grace that it seemed almost magical, as if the bonds that were designed to hold her had simply chosen to release their grip. For a moment that stretched into eternity, everyone present stared at the empty shackles. Lying in the dust while Celeste stood completely free, Victoria felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that she had just purchased someone who possessed capabilities that she didn't understand. The other enslaved people in the courtyard had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. While Thorne's hand moved instinctively toward the whip on his belt, Wickham muttered something about defective restraints and began gathering his remaining equipment with nervous haste. But it was Celeste's response to her sudden freedom that would haunt Victoria's thoughts for days to come. Instead of running or celebrating or even looking up in triumph, Celeste simply stood there with her head bowed, staring at the shackles that had held her just moments before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her expression was unreadable, but Victoria sensed a profound sadness in her posture that spoke of losses and sufferings that went far deeper than physical bondage. The transaction was completed without further incident, and Wickham departed Magnolia Creek within the hour. Victoria assigned Celeste to work in the main house under Ruth's supervision, reasoning that someone with domestic experience would be more useful than another field hand. She gave specific instructions that Celeste was to be watched carefully and reported any unusual behavior immediately. As the sun set on what had begun as a routine day, Victoria found herself standing on the front porch of the main house. looking out over the plantation that represented everything she had ever known about power, order, and her place in the world. The image of Celeste removing her own shackles played repeatedly in her mind, though she couldn't articulate why the moment had affected her so deeply. What Victoria didn't know was that the woman she had just purchased carried within her a strength and knowledge that would soon be tested by events beyond anyone's control. The war that seemed so distant was actually approaching Magnolia Creek with the inevitability of a hurricane. And when it arrived, everything that Victoria believed about herself and her world would be stripped away like leaves in a storm. The comfortable certainties that had defined her entire life were about to crumble, and the woman who had just removed her own shackles would prove to be the only person capable of showing Victoria what true freedom actually meant. 3 weeks after Celeste's arrival at Magnolia Creek, Victoria began noticing changes that she couldn't quite explain. The plantation's routine continued as it always had, with the enslaved workers rising before dawn to tend the cotton fields under Thorne's watchful supervision. The main house operated with its usual efficiency, meals appeared on schedule, and the financial records showed steady profits from the recent harvest. Yet something fundamental had shifted in ways that Victoria found increasingly unsettling. The first sign came during Victoria's weekly inspection of the slave quarters. She had made this same walk every Saturday morning for 2 years, observing the conditions in which her workforce lived, while ensuring that her property was being maintained according to her standards. The cabins were always clean when she arrived, their occupants properly respectful, and any problems quickly addressed through Thorne's disciplinary measures. This particular Saturday, however, Victoria noticed something different in the way people looked at her. The usual downcast eyes and hurried movements were still present, but there was an underlying current of something she had never encountered before. It wasn't defiance exactly, but rather a quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from several of the families she visited. Children who had always hidden behind their parents' legs now stood straighter, their gazes less fearful than she remembered. Victoria attributed these observations to her imagination, until she reached the cabin where Celeste had been assigned to live with an elderly woman named Sarah and her grandson Marcus. The 8-year-old boy had always been one of the most timid children on the plantation, stammering whenever Victoria addressed him directly, and often bursting into tears if Thorne raised his voice. Today, Marcus stood beside his grandmother with a composure that struck Victoria as completely out of character. When Victoria asked Sarah about the cabin's cleanliness, the older woman responded with her usual deference. But Marcus surprised everyone by speaking without being addressed. He politely corrected a minor detail about the cabin's maintenance schedule, providing information that was both accurate and delivered with a confidence that made Victoria take a step back in surprise. Sarah quickly apologized for her grandson's boldness, but Victoria noticed that she didn't seem genuinely distressed by his behavior. The second incident occurred during Sunday church services at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where Victoria occupied the Hayes family pew near the front of the sanctuary. Reverend Morrison delivered his weekly sermon about the divine order that placed some people in positions of authority over others, using familiar biblical passages to reinforce the social structure that Victoria had never questioned. The enslaved members of the congregation sat in the gallery above the main floor, listening to words that justified their bondage while maintaining the respectful silence that was expected of them. Victoria had heard these same themes countless times before, but on this particular Sunday, she found herself distracted by a subtle change in the atmosphere. The usual murmurs of agreement from the white congregation seemed somehow less enthusiastic than she remembered, while the enslaved people in the gallery maintained an almost perfect stillness that felt different from their typical behavior. She couldn't identify exactly what had changed, but the familiar comfort she had always derived from these services was mysteriously absent. After the service, Victoria was approached by her neighbor, Rebecca Thornwell, whose family owned a smaller plantation 5 miles to the east. Rebecca was a woman of Victoria's age who had recently married and was struggling to manage her inherited property while her husband served with Confederate forces in Virginia. The conversation that followed would plant seeds of doubt that Victoria had never allowed herself to consider. Rebecca spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences on her own plantation. Several of her most trusted house servants had been asking unusual questions about news from the war, displaying knowledge about military movements that they shouldn't have possessed. More troubling, productivity in her cotton fields had declined noticeably, with workers moving more slowly and requiring additional supervision to complete their daily tasks. Rebecca suspected that outside agitators might be spreading dangerous ideas among the enslaved population. Victoria listened to these concerns with growing unease, recognizing similarities to changes she had observed at Magnolia Creek. She had noticed that conversations in the slave quarters ended more abruptly when she approached, and that the songs her workers sang while laboring in the fields had subtly changed in both melody and lyrics. What had once been spirituals about biblical salvation now seemed to carry different meanings that she couldn't quite decipher. The conversation with Rebecca was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Samuel Mitchell, an elderly physician who had served the plantation families in the region for more than 30 years. Dr. Mitchell's weathered face bore the expression of someone who had witnessed significant changes during his long career, and his words carried a weight that demanded attention from both women. Dr. Mitchell had just returned from Savannah, where he had observed Union naval vessels blockading the port with increasing effectiveness. The war that had seemed distant and manageable was beginning to affect the economic foundations of their entire way of life. Cotton shipments were being interrupted, imported goods were becoming scarce, and military recruiters were pressing local men into service with growing urgency. More importantly, Dr. Mitchell had heard reliable reports of Union forces operating in other parts of Georgia, accompanied by large numbers of escaped slaves who were serving as guides and laborers for the advancing armies. The implications of Dr. Mitchell's report struck Victoria like a physical blow. She had convinced herself that the war would end quickly with Southern independence, allowing life at Magnolia Creek to continue unchanged. The possibility that Union forces might actually reach their area, bringing with them the promise of emancipation for her entire workforce, had never entered her calculations as a serious threat. Victoria returned to Magnolia Creek that afternoon, with her mind churning over possibilities she had never been forced to consider. The plantation that represented security and prosperity might actually be vulnerable to forces beyond her control. More troubling was the realization that the 300 people she considered her property might view the approaching conflict very differently than she did. What she saw as a threat to her way of life, they might see as an opportunity for liberation. That evening, Victoria decided to conduct her own investigation into the changes she had been observing. She instructed Ruth to arrange for Celeste to serve dinner in the main house dining room, a duty that would provide an opportunity for closer observation. Victoria had largely avoided direct interaction with her newest acquisition since the unsettling incident with the Shackles. But the growing sense of unease throughout the plantation demanded a more thorough assessment. Celeste entered the dining room, carrying Victoria's meal with the same grace she had displayed during the auction. Her movements were efficient and respectful, her demeanor appropriately subservient, yet Victoria sensed an undercurrent of something that hadn't been present in any of her previous servants. When Victoria addressed her directly, asking about her adjustment to life at Magnolia Creek, Celeste's responses were carefully measured and proper, but her dark eyes revealed an intelligence that Victoria found both fascinating and dangerous. During the course of their brief conversation, Victoria discovered that Celeste could read and write, skills that were illegal for enslaved people to possess in Georgia. When pressed about how she had acquired this education, Celeste explained that her previous owner's children had taught her in secret, presenting this information as a confession rather than an accomplishment. Victoria realized that she now possessed a servant whose capabilities far exceeded those of anyone else in her household, but also someone whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions about racial inferiority that justified the entire system of slavery. The revelation about Celeste's literacy led Victoria to make a decision that would prove to have far-reaching consequences. She instructed Celeste to begin assisting with the plantation's record-keeping, a task that required someone capable of understanding complex financial information. Victoria justified this assignment as a practical matter, reasoning that Celeste's skills could improve the efficiency of her business operations. What she didn't acknowledge, even to herself, was that she was genuinely curious about what someone with Celeste's intelligence might observe about the plantation's management. Over the following week, Celeste demonstrated an aptitude for the financial aspects of plantation operations that surprised Victoria. She quickly mastered the various ledgers that tracked cotton production, equipment maintenance, and workforce productivity. More importantly, she began asking questions about certain entries that revealed analytical thinking of a sophistication that Victoria had never encountered among her enslaved workers. Celeste noticed patterns in the productivity data that suggested correlations between various factors affecting cotton yields. She identified inefficiencies in resource allocation that could be corrected to improve profitability. Most remarkably, she proposed organizational changes that could increase output while reducing the physical demands on the workforce, suggestions that demonstrated both mathematical skill and what appeared to be genuine concern for the welfare of her fellow slaves. Victoria found herself engaging in conversations with Celeste that went far beyond the simple instructions she typically gave to her servants. These discussions revealed that Celeste possessed not just intelligence, but also knowledge about subjects ranging from agricultural science to current events. She had somehow acquired information about the progress of the war that was more accurate and detailed than what Victoria had been receiving from her usual sources. The extent of Celeste's knowledge became apparent when she mentioned, almost casually, that Union forces under General Sherman were operating much closer to their area than Victoria had realized. When pressed for details, Celeste revealed that she had been receiving information through a network of communication that connected enslaved people across multiple plantations. This underground system had been tracking military movements, sharing news about emancipated communities, and coordinating assistance for those attempting to escape to Union lines. Victoria was stunned to learn that such a network existed, operating completely outside her awareness despite her belief that she maintained strict control over every aspect of life at Magnolia Creek. The realization that her enslaved workers possessed their own information systems, their own means of communication, and their own understanding of the changing political situation challenged everything she thought she knew about managing a plantation. The conversation about the communication network led to an even more disturbing revelation. Celeste carefully explained that many of the enslaved people at Magnolia Creek were aware that Union forces were approaching their region, and that emancipation might be a realistic possibility within a matter of months rather than years. This knowledge was affecting their willingness to accept the brutal conditions that had always characterized their lives, leading to the subtle changes in behavior that Victoria had been observing. Victoria demanded to know why Celeste was sharing this information with her, suspecting that it might be part of some elaborate deception or manipulation. Celeste's response was delivered with the same calm dignity she had displayed since her arrival. She explained that she believed Victoria was different from other slaveholders she had encountered, someone who might be capable of understanding that the current system was both morally wrong and practically unsustainable. The implications of this conversation left Victoria feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted fundamentally. Everything she had believed about the loyalty and ignorance of her workforce was proving to be an illusion. The people she had considered property were actually thinking, planning individuals who understood their situation far better than she had ever imagined. More troubling, they possessed the means to act on that understanding in ways that could threaten everything she had inherited from her father. Victoria spent the remainder of that week observing her plantation with new eyes, looking for signs of the changes that Celeste had described. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. The subtle alterations in behavior, the decreased productivity, the different quality of interactions all pointed to a workforce that was preparing for possibilities that Victoria had never considered. The songs she heard in the cotton fields now clearly contained coded messages about escape routes and safe havens. The conversations that ended when she approached were obviously discussions about subjects that her workers didn't want her to understand. Even the children seemed to be part of a community that existed parallel to the official structure of the plantation, maintaining their own values and hopes despite the oppressive conditions they endured daily. As Victoria grappled with these revelations, news arrived that would transform her theoretical concerns into immediate crisis. A messenger from Savannah brought word that Union forces had begun a major offensive that was advancing directly toward their region. The army that was approaching included not just Northern soldiers, but also thousands of formerly enslaved people who were serving as guides, laborers, and even combat troops. The war that had seemed distant and manageable was suddenly less than a week away from Magnolia Creek. Victoria faced the terrifying possibility that her entire way of life might be swept away by forces she couldn't control or even fully comprehend. The comfortable certainties that had defined her existence were crumbling rapidly, and the woman who had removed her own shackles was proving to be the only person who truly understood what was coming. The first cannonball struck the eastern cotton fields at dawn on a Tuesday morning in November, sending a column of black smoke into the grey sky above Magnolia Creek. Victoria was drinking her morning coffee on the front porch when the distant boom echoed across the plantation, followed by the unmistakable sound of musket fire from somewhere beyond the tree line. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she stood frozen with the delicate china cup halfway to her lips, unable to process what was happening to her carefully ordered world. Edmund Thorne came running from the direction of the slave quarters, his face pale with panic as he struggled to catch his breath. The Union Army had arrived during the night, surrounding the plantation with what appeared to be an entire regiment of soldiers accompanied by artillery pieces and supply wagons. More shocking than the military presence was the sight of hundreds of formerly enslaved people who were traveling with the army, some wearing Union uniforms and carrying rifles, others working as scouts and laborers for the advancing forces. Victoria's mind reeled as she tried to comprehend the implications of what Thorne was describing. The war that had seemed manageable and distant was now literally at her doorstep, bringing with it the promise of emancipation for every person she had considered her property. The comfortable assumptions that had defined her entire existence were being shattered by forces she had never seriously imagined could reach Magnolia Creek. The sound of approaching horses drew Victoria's attention to the main road, where a column of blue-uniformed cavalry was advancing toward the plantation house. At the head of the column rode an officer whose bearing and equipment marked him as someone of considerable rank. Behind him came a mixed group of Union soldiers and black men in military uniforms, their rifles ready and their expressions grimly determined. Victoria had never seen armed black men before, and the sight challenged everything she had been taught about racial hierarchy and natural order. These were not the submissive, dependent people she had imagined all enslaved individuals to be, but rather confident soldiers who carried themselves with the pride and discipline of professional warriors. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that Victoria found herself unable to move or speak as the column approached the main house. The officer leading the advance was Colonel James Harrison, a career military man from Massachusetts who had been fighting in Georgia for 6 months. Harrison had participated in the liberation of dozens of plantations throughout the region, and he understood both the military and moral dimensions of his mission. His orders were clear: secure the plantation, liberate the enslaved population, and confiscate any resources that could support the Confederate war effort. Harrison dismounted near the front steps of the main house and approached Victoria with the formal courtesy that his military training demanded, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. His voice was firm but not hostile, as he informed her that Magnolia Creek was now under Union control, and that all enslaved people on the property were immediately and permanently free. The authority with which he spoke made it clear that this was not a negotiation or request, but rather a statement of accomplished fact. Victoria's first instinct was to protest that the Union Army had no legal right to confiscate her property or interfere with her business operations. She began explaining that the people living on her plantation were legally owned according to Georgia state law, and that federal authorities could not simply declare them free without due process. The words sounded hollow even as she spoke them, particularly when she noticed several of her former slaves watching the exchange with expressions that mixed hope, fear, and barely contained excitement. Colonel Harrison's response was delivered with the patience of someone who had heard similar arguments many times before. He explained that the Emancipation Proclamation had legally freed all enslaved people in rebellious states, and that Union military forces were authorized to enforce this federal decree regardless of local laws or customs. More pointedly, he noted that Victoria's plantation had been producing cotton that supported the Confederate war effort, making it a legitimate military target under the laws of warfare. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the slave quarters, where Union soldiers were formally announcing the emancipation to the plantation's black population. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with people crying, shouting, embracing each other, and falling to their knees in prayer. Some began singing spirituals that Victoria had heard countless times before, but which now carried new meanings about freedom and deliverance that she finally understood. Victoria watched this scene of celebration with growing horror as she realized that the people she had considered loyal and content were actually rejoicing at their liberation from her control. The paternalistic fantasy that she had provided them with security and care in exchange for their labor was being shattered by the obvious joy they felt at the prospect of determining their own destinies. Everything she had believed about the relationship between herself and her workforce was proving to be a complete delusion. The most shocking moment came when Celeste emerged from the main house, carrying a small bundle of personal belongings. Victoria had somehow expected that Celeste, who had been working closely with her on the plantation's records, might choose to remain at Magnolia Creek even after emancipation. Instead, Celeste walked directly toward the Union soldiers with the same dignity she had displayed when removing her shackles. And clearly intending to leave the plantation immediately, Victoria called out to Celeste, asking where she intended to go and how she planned to survive without the security that Magnolia Creek provided. The questions revealed Victoria's continued inability to understand that enslaved people might prefer uncertainty and hardship to the comfortable bondage she had offered. Celeste turned back briefly, her dark eyes meeting Victoria's gaze, with an expression that combined pity and forgiveness in equal measure. Celeste's response was delivered in the clear, educated voice that had always unsettled Victoria. She explained that she had family members in Savannah who had been freed earlier in the war, and that the underground network she had mentioned previously would help her reach them safely. More importantly, she expressed her intention to use her literacy and mathematical skills to help other formerly enslaved people navigate the challenges of freedom, turning the education that had been illegal under slavery into a tool for community empowerment. The practical implications of the plantation's liberation began to dawn on Victoria as she watched her entire workforce preparing to leave Magnolia Creek. Without enslaved labor, the cotton fields could not be maintained, the harvest could not be completed, and the financial foundation of her existence would collapse completely. The wealth that had seemed so secure just hours earlier was evaporating, as rapidly as morning mist under the harsh light of changed circumstances. Colonel Harrison informed Victoria that she would be allowed to remain in the main house for the time being, but that the plantation's resources would be redistributed to support the formerly enslaved population and the Union military effort. The cotton that had been harvested but not yet shipped would be confiscated. The livestock would be used to feed the advancing army, and the agricultural equipment would be given to black families who wished to establish their own farms in the region. The systematic dismantling of everything Victoria had inherited from her father proceeded with military efficiency throughout the day. Union soldiers conducted a thorough inventory of the plantation's assets, while former slaves gathered their few possessions and made preparations to leave the only home most of them had ever known. The slave quarters that had housed entire families in single rooms were abandoned as people chose to take their chances in an uncertain world rather than remain in the familiar confines of bondage. Victoria found herself wandering through the main house like a ghost, observing the destruction of her previous life while struggling to comprehend what was happening around her. The servants who had maintained her comfortable existence were gone. The income that had supported her lifestyle had disappeared, and the social structure that had placed her at the apex of local society had been completely overturned. For the first time in her 26 years, Victoria faced the prospect of having to provide for herself without the advantages that inherited wealth and enslaved labor had always provided. The most disorienting aspect of the day was the realization that many of the people she had considered simple field hands possessed skills, knowledge, and ambitions that she had never suspected. Former slaves were discussing plans to open schools, establish businesses, and reunite with family members who had been sold to other plantations years earlier. The intelligence and capability that Victoria had always denied were suddenly visible everywhere she looked, forcing her to confront the magnitude of her previous blindness. Edmund Thorne approached Victoria near sunset with the news that he was leaving Magnolia Creek immediately. The overseer who had enforced her authority through violence and intimidation understood that his position was no longer tenable in a world where his former victims were free to seek justice. He had heard rumors that some plantation overseers in liberated areas had been killed by people seeking revenge for years of brutality, and he had no intention of remaining to face such consequences. Thorne's departure left Victoria completely alone for the first time in her adult life. The house that had always bustled with activity fell silent except for the distant sounds of celebration from the former slave quarters. The isolation was profound and terrifying, forcing Victoria to confront not just the loss of her material wealth, but also the complete collapse of her understanding of herself and her place in the world. As darkness fell over Magnolia Creek, Victoria stood on the front porch, where she had begun the day drinking coffee and contemplating routine plantation business. The columns that had symbolized her family's prosperity now seemed like tombstones, marking the death of a way of life that would never return. The cotton fields that had generated her wealth stretched away into the darkness, empty of the workers who had made their productivity possible. The sound of wagon wheels on the main road drew Victoria's attention to a final exodus of families leaving the plantation under cover of darkness. Some were traveling toward Savannah, where Union forces had established camps for formerly enslaved people. Others were heading to rural areas where they hoped to establish independent farming communities. All of them were choosing uncertainty over the security that Victoria had believed she provided, a choice that finally forced her to acknowledge the fundamental cruelty of the system she had inherited and perpetuated. The last person Victoria saw leaving Magnolia Creek was Celeste, who paused at the end of the main drive to look back at the plantation house one final time. Even in the dim light, Victoria could see the expression of quiet triumph on Celeste's face as she prepared to begin a life of her own choosing. The woman who had removed her own shackles was now walking away from everything that bondage had represented, carrying with her the dignity that no amount of oppression had been able to destroy. Victoria remained on the porch long after the last wagon had disappeared into the night, trying to process the complete transformation that had occurred in a single day. The world she had inherited from her father was gone forever, along with all the assumptions about race, class, and power that had made her comfortable existence possible. Tomorrow would bring challenges that she had never been forced to face, in a world where her previous advantages meant nothing. The crisis that had struck Magnolia Creek was not just military or economic, but fundamentally moral. Victoria's entire understanding of herself as a person of worth and accomplishment had been built on a foundation of human bondage that she had never questioned. Now that foundation had been swept away, leaving her to discover whether she possessed any genuine character beneath the artificial. Superiority that inherited wealth and enslaved labor had provided this woman who had always judged others by their circumstances was about to learn what it meant to be truly powerless. While the people she had considered property began the difficult work of building lives based on freedom, dignity, and self-determination. The shackles that had bound Celeste were gone forever, but the chains that had imprisoned Victoria's understanding of human worth were only beginning to break. Victoria woke on her third morning of freedom to discover that someone had stolen her remaining horses during the night. The theft represented more than just the loss of valuable animals. It meant she was now completely stranded at Magnolia Creek, with no means of transportation to reach the outside world. The isolation that had begun as a psychological condition was becoming a practical reality that threatened her very survival. The main house, which had once required a staff of 12 people to maintain properly, was rapidly falling into disrepair without anyone to perform basic maintenance tasks. Dust accumulated on furniture that Victoria had never learned to clean herself. The kitchen, which had always produced elaborate meals through Ruth's skilled management, now challenged Victoria's ability to prepare even the simplest foods. The elegant lifestyle she had inherited from her father was proving impossible to maintain through her own unskilled efforts. Victoria's first attempt to venture beyond the plantation's boundaries occurred when she decided to walk to the nearest neighboring property, hoping to find assistance from other white families who might have survived the Union occupation. The 5-mile journey to the Thornwell plantation took her through territory that had been transformed by the passage of military forces and liberated populations. Fields that had once been carefully cultivated lay abandoned. Buildings showed signs of damage from artillery fire, and the roads were marked by the debris of a social order that had collapsed completely. When Victoria finally reached the Thornwell property, she discovered that Rebecca and her family had fled weeks earlier, leaving behind only an elderly caretaker who informed her that most of the white plantation families in the region had either escaped to more secure areas or been arrested by Union authorities. The comfortable social network that had once provided Victoria with companionship and mutual support had been scattered to the winds, leaving her as isolated socially as she was geographically. The return journey to Magnolia Creek proved even more difficult than the outbound trip. Victoria's pampered feet, accustomed to soft slippers and short walks on manicured grounds, were blistered and bleeding by the time she reached home. The physical discomfort was accompanied by a growing awareness that she possessed none of the practical skills necessary for survival. In a world where inherited wealth and enslaved labor were no longer available to cushion her from harsh realities. The next crisis emerged when Victoria realized that her food supplies were running dangerously low. The plantation's pantries had been well stocked when the Union Army arrived, but 3 days of inexperienced rationing had depleted her resources more rapidly than she had anticipated. More troubling was the discovery that she had no idea how to preserve food, prepare meals from basic ingredients, or manage household supplies efficiently. The domestic skills that had been performed by enslaved women were mysteries to someone who had never been expected to learn them. Victoria's attempt to gather food from the plantation's abandoned vegetable gardens revealed the extent of her ignorance about basic survival tasks. She could identify ripe tomatoes and corn, but she had no knowledge about which wild plants were edible, how to preserve fresh produce for future consumption, or even how to operate the equipment necessary for food preparation. The gardens that had fed hundreds of people through the skilled labor of enslaved workers were useless to someone who lacked the knowledge to harvest and utilize their bounty. The 4th day brought a visit from Colonel Harrison, who had returned to check on conditions at Magnolia Creek as part of his ongoing responsibilities for the liberated territory. Victoria's appearance shocked the experienced military officer, who had not expected to find her in such deteriorated circumstances. Her once pristine clothing was stained and wrinkled. Her carefully maintained hair hung loose and unkempt, and her hands showed the cuts and blisters of someone unaccustomed to manual labor. Colonel Harrison's assessment of Victoria's situation was both compassionate and brutally realistic. He explained that the Union Army could provide basic food rations to prevent starvation, but that long-term survival would require Victoria to develop practical skills or find some means of supporting herself in the new economic reality. The government was establishing programs to assist both formerly enslaved people and displaced white civilians. But these programs required recipients to contribute useful labor in exchange for assistance. The conversation revealed the depth of Victoria's practical helplessness in ways that forced her to confront the artificial nature of her previous advantages. She had never learned to cook, clean, sew, or perform any of the tasks necessary for independent survival. Her education had focused on managing enslaved workers rather than performing actual work, leaving her completely unprepared for a world where personal labor was required for survival. The skills that had made her an effective plantation mistress were useless in circumstances where she had no one to command. Colonel Harrison's offer of assistance came with conditions that challenged Victoria's remaining sense of superiority. The Union Army was establishing a refugee camp near Savannah, where displaced civilians could receive food and shelter in exchange for contributing to community work projects. Victoria would be expected to perform manual labor alongside formerly enslaved people, following orders from supervisors who might themselves be black. The prospect of accepting such arrangements represented a complete inversion of the social hierarchy that had previously defined her existence. Victoria's initial response was to reject Harrison's offer with the indignation of someone who still believed that her background entitled her to preferential treatment. She insisted that there must be other options available for someone of her social standing, perhaps assistance from relatives in other states or financial support from Confederate authorities. Harrison's patient explanation that the Confederacy was collapsing and that her previous social connections were now meaningless gradually penetrated Victoria's defensive denial. The Colonel's departure left Victoria alone with the knowledge that her choices were narrowing to stark alternatives: accept charity that required her to work alongside people she had previously enslaved, or face the possibility of starvation in the ruins of her inherited privilege. The comfortable buffer that wealth had always provided between herself and the harsh realities of survival was gone, leaving her to confront challenges that she had never imagined. could affect someone of her background. The fifth day brought an unexpected visitor who would force Victoria to confront the moral dimensions of her situation in ways that purely practical considerations had not. Martha Washington, an elderly black woman who had been enslaved at Magnolia Creek for 40 years before emancipation, returned to the plantation carrying a basket of food and medical supplies. Her appearance at Victoria's door represented an act of mercy that Victoria struggled to understand or accept Martha's explanation. For her return was delivered with the dignity that had always characterized her interactions with Victoria, despite decades of brutal treatment. She had heard through the network of formerly enslaved people that Victoria was struggling to survive alone, and she had come back to offer assistance to someone who had never shown her similar kindness. The irony of the situation was lost on neither woman. The person who had been considered property was now in a position to help her former owner. Victoria's conversation with Martha revealed the extent to which her previous understanding of relationships had been distorted by the power dynamics of slavery. Martha spoke about the plantation's operations with knowledge and insight that Victoria had never recognized, describing innovations and improvements that enslaved workers had developed but had never been credited for implementing. The intelligence and capability that Victoria had denied were suddenly visible in ways that forced her to acknowledge the magnitude of her previous blindness. Martha's offer to teach Victoria basic survival skills represented more than practical assistance. It was an opportunity for moral education that Victoria had never previously encountered. The woman, who had been whipped for minor infractions, was now patiently explaining how to prepare simple meals, preserve food, and maintain a household through personal labor. The grace with which Martha approached this teaching role revealed a character strength that Victoria had never possessed, despite all her inherited advantages. The lessons that Martha provided over the following days forced Victoria to confront the physical realities of work that she had always assigned to others. Her soft hands blistered from handling rough tools, her back ached from bending over cooking fires, and her feet swelled from standing for extended periods. The discomfort was accompanied by a growing appreciation for the skill and endurance that domestic labor required, qualities that she had never acknowledged in the people who had performed these tasks for her. Benefit, Martha's patient instruction was accompanied by stories about life in the slave quarters that revealed experiences Victoria had never understood despite living in close proximity to them for years. She learned about families that had been separated by sales, children who had been born into bondage with no hope of freedom, and individuals who had maintained their humanity and dignity despite systematic dehumanization. The narratives challenged Victoria's comfortable assumptions about the contentment and loyalty of enslaved people in ways that forced her to confront the cruelty that had supported her lifestyle. The most difficult lesson came when Martha explained why she had chosen to return and help Victoria despite having every reason to celebrate her former owner's downfall. Her motivation was not forgiveness or charity in the conventional sense, but rather a commitment to treating all people with the dignity that she had been denied throughout her own life. Martha's moral framework was based on principles that transcended the racial hierarchies that had governed Victoria's thinking, offering a vision of human relationships based on genuine equality rather than inherited privilege. As the week progressed, Victoria found herself developing a grudging respect for Martha that evolved into something approaching genuine admiration. The woman who had been considered property possessed wisdom, strength, and moral clarity that Victoria had never cultivated despite all her educational and social advantages. The relationship between them was beginning to shift from one of desperate dependence to something that resembled mutual respect. Though Victoria was still struggling to fully comprehend the implications of this transformation, the descent into chaos that Victoria was experiencing was not just external, but profoundly internal as well. Every assumption about her own worth, every belief about racial superiority, every comfortable certainty about social order was being systematically dismantled by circumstances that forced her to confront reality without the protective barriers that privilege had always provided. The woman who had inherited a world was discovering that she possessed nothing of genuine value beyond the capacity to learn from those she had previously oppressed. Martha's presence at Magnolia Creek represented more than just practical assistance. It was a bridge between the world that Victoria had lost and the world she might yet build if she proved capable of genuine transformation. The question that remained unanswered was whether Victoria possessed the moral courage to cross that bridge, or whether she would retreat into the bitter resentment of someone who had lost everything without learning anything from the experience. The turning point came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening when Victoria discovered that her food supplies had been contaminated by water leaking through the mansion's deteriorating roof. Martha had left 2 days earlier to visit family members in Savannah, leaving Victoria alone to face a crisis that threatened her immediate survival. The rice and flour that represented her remaining sustenance had turned moldy and inedible, while the vegetables from the garden had rotted due to her inexperienced preservation attempts. For the first time since the Union Army's arrival, Victoria faced the genuine possibility of starvation. Victoria's initial response was to sit in the once elegant parlor and cry, with the helpless desperation of someone who had never been forced to solve problems through her own resourcefulness. The tears came not just from hunger and fear, but from the crushing realization that she possessed none of the skills necessary for basic survival. 26 years of privileged existence had left her as helpless as a child when confronted with challenges that millions of people face daily throughout their lives. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted Victoria's self-pity, and she looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the stormy evening sky. Her heart leapt with the hope that Martha had returned early from Savannah, but as the visitor stepped into the lamplight, Victoria recognized someone she had never expected to see again. Celeste stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain and carrying a canvas bag that appeared to contain supplies. Victoria's first emotion was confusion, followed quickly by a mixture of shame and desperate gratitude. The woman she had purchased as property just weeks earlier was now in a position to offer assistance to her former owner, creating a role reversal that challenged every assumption Victoria had ever held about social hierarchy and human relationships. The irony was so complete that Victoria found herself unable to speak, staring at Celeste with the bewildered expression of someone whose entire understanding of the world had been turned upside down. Celeste entered the house without invitation, her movements displaying the same quiet confidence that had marked her behavior since the day of her arrival at Magnolia Creek. She set down her bag and began examining the water damage with the practical eye of someone accustomed to solving problems through direct action rather than relying on others to handle difficulties. Her assessment of Victoria's situation was swift and comprehensive, taking in not just the immediate crisis of the spoiled food, but also the broader deterioration of the house and its owner. When Celeste finally spoke, her voice carried none of the deference that had characterized her previous interactions with Victoria. The formal barriers that slavery had imposed between them were gone, replaced by a directness that reflected the fundamental equality that emancipation had established. She had heard through the network of formerly enslaved people that Victoria was struggling to survive alone, and she had come to offer assistance that went beyond mere charity to encompass something approaching moral obligation. Celeste's explanation for her return forced Victoria to confront questions about human nature and moral responsibility that she had never previously considered. The woman who had every reason to celebrate Victoria's downfall was instead demonstrating a capacity for compassion that transcended the brutal history between them. Her motivation was not forgiveness in the conventional sense, but rather a commitment to preventing unnecessary suffering, regardless of its victims' previous behavior. The assistance that Celeste provided over the following hours was both practical and educational. She showed Victoria how to salvage some of the damaged food through careful cleaning and preparation, explained techniques for preventing future contamination, and demonstrated methods for preserving fresh produce that would have prevented the current crisis. More importantly, she began teaching Victoria skills that went beyond immediate survival to encompass the broader capabilities necessary for independent living. Victoria's response to Celeste's instruction revealed the depth of her transformation. From the arrogant plantation mistress who had mocked a woman in shackles just months earlier, she listened carefully to every explanation, asked questions that demonstrated genuine interest in learning, and attempted to follow directions without the impatience or condescension that had once characterized her interactions with enslaved workers. The physical discomfort of unfamiliar labor was accepted without complaint as the necessary price of acquiring essential knowledge. The conversation that developed between the two women during their shared work represented a form of communication that had been impossible under the constraints of slavery. For the first time, Victoria heard Celeste express opinions, share experiences, and reveal aspects of her personality that the institution of bondage had systematically suppressed. The intelligence that Victoria had glimpsed during Celeste's work with the plantation records was now fully displayed in discussions that ranged from practical matters to philosophical questions about freedom, dignity, and human worth. Celeste's account of her experiences since leaving Magnolia Creek provided Victoria with insights into the challenges and opportunities that emancipation had created for formerly enslaved people. She had reunited with family members in Savannah, found work as a teacher in a school established for freed slaves, and begun participating in political organizations that were working to secure civil rights for the black population. Her success in navigating these new opportunities demonstrated capabilities that Victoria had never imagined possible for someone she had considered property. The stories that Celeste shared about other formerly enslaved people revealed a community that was actively building institutions, establishing businesses, and creating social networks based on principles of mutual support and collective advancement. Churches were serving as centers for political organization. Schools were being established to provide education that had been illegal under slavery, and economic cooperatives were being formed to provide financial security for people who had never been allowed to accumulate wealth. Victoria's understanding of the emancipation process was transformed by Celeste's descriptions of the systematic efforts being made to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The Union Army was providing not just liberation from bondage, but also practical assistance in the form of education, medical care, and economic opportunities. Religious organizations from the North were sending teachers and missionaries to establish schools and churches. Political leaders were working to secure legal protections that would make freedom meaningful in practical terms. The contrast between this organized, forward-looking approach to freedom and Victoria's own helpless response to changed circumstances was both humbling and instructive. The people she had considered incapable of self-governance were demonstrating remarkable organizational skills and long-term planning abilities. While she struggled to manage the basic requirements of daily survival, the racial stereotypes that had justified slavery were being systematically disproven by the evidence of black achievement that Celeste described. As the evening progressed, Victoria found herself engaging in conversations about subjects that she had never discussed with any black person during her previous life. Celeste's perspectives on literature, politics, and social issues revealed an intellectual sophistication that challenged Victoria's assumptions about racial differences in intelligence and capability. The woman who had been legally considered 3/5 of a person was demonstrating analytical abilities that surpassed Victoria's own in many areas. The most difficult moment in their conversation came when Celeste directly addressed the moral dimensions of slavery and its impact on both enslaved people and their owners. Her analysis of the institution was delivered without anger or bitterness, but with a clarity that forced Victoria to confront the magnitude of the injustices she had perpetuated. Celeste described the psychological damage that bondage inflicted on all participants, including slaveholders who became corrupted by the absolute power they wielded over other human beings. Victoria's initial impulse was to defend herself by arguing that she had treated her enslaved workers better than many other plantation owners, providing adequate food and shelter while avoiding the worst excesses of physical brutality. Celeste's response was patient but uncompromising in its rejection of such rationalizations. She explained that the fundamental evil of slavery lay not in its specific practices, but in its denial of human dignity and agency, violations that could not be mitigated by paternalistic kindness. The conversation about slavery's moral dimensions led to a broader discussion about the nature of human relationships and the principles that should govern interactions between people of different backgrounds. Celeste's vision of society was based on genuine equality rather than hierarchical arrangements that privileged some individuals over others based on race, class, or inherited wealth. Her ideas about justice, democracy, and human rights represented a complete alternative to the social order that Victoria had inherited and defended. Victoria's response to these challenging ideas revealed the extent of her intellectual and moral transformation since the collapse of her previous world. Instead of rejecting Celeste's perspectives out of hand, she found herself genuinely considering arguments that would have seemed absurd just months earlier. The practical experience of dependency and vulnerability had opened her mind to possibilities that privilege had previously rendered invisible. The alliance that was forming between Victoria and Celeste was based on more than immediate necessity. It represented a fundamental shift in Victoria's understanding of human relationships and social responsibility. The woman who had once bought and sold people was learning to see them as individuals deserving of respect and consideration. The process was painful and sometimes humiliating, but it was also liberating in ways that Victoria was only beginning to understand. Celeste's decision to spend several days at Magnolia Creek, teaching Victoria essential survival skills and sharing her perspectives on the changing world, represented an act of moral generosity that Victoria struggled to comprehend fully. The woman who had every reason to enjoy her former owner's suffering was instead working to prevent it, demonstrating a capacity for forgiveness and compassion that Victoria had never possessed despite all her religious education and social advantages. The practical skills that Celeste taught during those days were accompanied by lessons about dignity, resilience, and the importance of maintaining hope even in difficult circumstances. Victoria learned not just how to cook and clean and preserve food, but also how to find meaning and purpose in work that she had previously considered beneath her station. The physical labor that had once seemed degrading was revealed to be a source of genuine accomplishment when performed with skill and care. By the end of the week, Victoria had acquired enough basic competencies to survive independently, but more importantly, she had begun to develop a new understanding of herself and her relationship to other people. The artificial superiority that inherited wealth had provided was being replaced by a more authentic sense of worth based on her ability to contribute useful labor and treat others with genuine respect. The transformation was far from complete, and Victoria still struggled with ingrained prejudices and assumptions that decades of conditioning had embedded deeply in her consciousness. However, the foundation for genuine change had been established through her interaction with Celeste. creating possibilities for continued growth that would have been impossible without this unlikely alliance between former owner and former slave. When Celeste prepared to return to Savannah, she extended an invitation that would force Victoria to make a choice that would determine the direction of her future life. The school where Celeste worked as a teacher needed someone to help with administrative tasks, organizing supplies, and assisting with the practical challenges of educating people who were learning to read and write for the first time. The position would provide Victoria with basic housing and food in exchange for useful work, but it would also require her to live and work alongside formerly enslaved people as an equal rather than a superior. Victoria's response to this invitation would reveal whether the transformation she had begun was genuine or merely a temporary adaptation to desperate circumstances. The comfortable world of inherited privilege was gone forever, but the world of genuine human relationships and meaningful work remained available to someone willing to embrace the principles of equality and mutual respect that Celeste embodied. The question was whether Victoria possessed the moral courage to step fully into that new world, or whether she would retreat into the bitterness and resentment of someone who had lost everything. Without learning anything from the experience, the alliance that had formed between Victoria and Celeste represented more than a practical arrangement for mutual assistance. It was a bridge between two different ways of understanding human worth and social relationships. The woman who had removed her own shackles was now offering to help remove the invisible chains that bound Victoria's understanding of herself and others. Whether Victoria would accept that liberation remained to be seen, Victoria's decision to accept Celeste's invitation came after 3 sleepless nights of wrestling with the implications of abandoning everything she had once considered essential to her identity. The journey to Savannah would mark the final severing of her connection to Magnolia Creek and the world of inherited privilege that had defined her existence for 26 years. More challenging than leaving behind material possessions was the prospect of entering a community where her previous status meant nothing, and where her worth would be measured solely by her willingness to contribute useful work alongside people she had once owned. The wagon ride to Savannah took 2 days, during which Victoria experienced the South from a perspective she had never previously encountered. The landscape bore the scars of military occupation and social transformation, with abandoned plantations standing as monuments to a way of life that would never return. More striking were the signs of new beginnings emerging from the ruins of the old order: small farms worked by black families, schools housed in former slave quarters, and churches where formerly enslaved people gathered to worship in freedom for the first time in their lives. Victoria's arrival at the Freedmen's School in Savannah marked her entry into a world that challenged every assumption she had ever held about racial relationships and social organization. The school occupied a large building that had once served as a cotton warehouse, its interior transformed into classrooms where adults and children sat side by side, learning to read and write with an intensity that spoke of dreams deferred but not abandoned. The sight of 50-year-old men struggling to master their letters alongside 6-year-old children created an emotional impact that Victoria had not anticipated. Celeste's introduction of Victoria to the school community required careful management of tensions that arose from the complex history between former slaves and former slaveholders. Many of the students and teachers viewed Victoria's presence with suspicion, understanding that someone from her background might harbor attitudes that could undermine the inclusive environment they were working to create. The challenge was compounded by Victoria's own nervousness about interacting with people who had every reason to resent everything she represented. The school's principal, a remarkable man named Frederick Douglass Washington, proved to be Victoria's most formidable test of character and commitment. Washington had been born into slavery in Virginia, escaped to freedom in 1859, and spent the war years working with abolitionist organizations in Philadelphia before returning south to establish educational programs for formerly enslaved people. His intelligence, dignity, and natural authority created a presence that commanded respect from everyone in the school, regardless of their background or previous experiences. Washington's initial conversation with Victoria was conducted with the diplomatic skill of someone accustomed to navigating complex racial dynamics while maintaining his principles. He explained that the school's mission was to provide education that would enable formerly enslaved people to participate fully in American society as free citizens. This goal required not just literacy and numeracy, but also instruction in history, civic responsibility, and the rights and obligations of citizenship. The curriculum was designed to prepare students for a future based on equality rather than the racial subordination that had characterized their past. Victoria's role in this educational mission would involve administrative tasks that supported the teachers' work while also requiring her to interact directly with students and their families. She would help organize supplies, maintain attendance records, and assist with the practical challenges of operating a school in a community that lacked many basic resources. More importantly, she would need to demonstrate through her behavior that genuine cooperation between people of different racial backgrounds was possible. The first week of Victoria's work at the school tested her commitment in ways that revealed the depth of her remaining prejudices and the distance she still needed to travel toward genuine equality. Her ingrained habits of expecting deference from black people created awkward moments when she unconsciously gave orders to teachers who were her peers rather than her subordinates. The automatic assumptions about intellectual capacity that had justified slavery in her mind were challenged daily by interactions with students whose eagerness to learn and rapid progress contradicted everything she had been taught about racial differences. The most difficult challenge came when Victoria was assigned to assist with a reading class, taught by a young woman named Sarah Freeman, who had been enslaved on a plantation just 20 miles from Magnolia Creek. Sarah's family had been sold away from her when she was 12 years old, separating her from parents and siblings she had never seen again. Despite these traumatic experiences, Sarah had maintained a commitment to education and self-improvement that enabled her to become one of the school's most effective teachers within months of gaining her freedom. Victoria's initial interaction with Sarah was marked by the awkward politeness of two people navigating a relationship that had no precedent in either of their previous experiences. The formal courtesies that slavery had imposed between black and white women were no longer appropriate, but genuine friendship seemed impossible given the vast differences in their backgrounds and experiences. The challenge was finding a middle ground that acknowledged their equality while respecting the reality of their different perspectives on the world they both inhabited. The breakthrough in their relationship came during a crisis that tested both women's character and commitment to the school's mission. A group of white men from Savannah's business community arrived at the school with complaints about the education being provided to formerly enslaved people. They argued that teaching black children to read and write above a basic level would create unrealistic expectations about their future opportunities and could lead to social unrest. More threatening was their suggestion that the YI school's funding might be withdrawn if the curriculum was not modified to emphasize vocational training rather than academic subjects. Victoria's response to this confrontation revealed the extent of her transformation from the woman who had once shared these men's assumptions about racial hierarchy and social order. Instead of remaining silent or attempting to mediate between the two sides, she spoke directly in defense of the school's educational mission and the capabilities of its students. Her words carried the authority of someone who had witnessed firsthand the intelligence and determination that the students displayed daily, contradicting the stereotypes that the white Visitors used to justify their demands for educational limitations. The impact of Victoria's defense of the school extended far beyond the immediate confrontation with the white businessmen. Her willingness to take a public stand against people from her own racial and class background demonstrated a commitment to principles rather than loyalty to group identity. The students and teachers who witnessed her intervention understood that she had chosen to align herself with their community rather than with the comfortable prejudices of her previous social circle. Sarah Freeman's response to Victoria's intervention marked the beginning of a genuine friendship that transcended the artificial barriers that slavery had imposed between them. In the days following the confrontation, Sarah began sharing stories about her experiences that helped Victoria understand the human cost of the institution she had inherited and perpetuated. These conversations were painful for Victoria, as they forced her to confront the specific ways that her comfortable lifestyle had been built on the suffering of people she had never allowed herself to see as fully human. The educational work that Victoria performed at the school became increasingly meaningful as she developed relationships with individual students and began to understand their personal struggles and aspirations. She worked with elderly men who had spent their entire lives in bondage, but were determined to learn reading skills that would enable them to study the Bible independently. She assisted young women who were preparing for careers as teachers, understanding that education was their pathway to economic independence and social advancement. One of Victoria's most challenging students was a teenage boy named Marcus Thompson, whose anger about his experiences under slavery initially made him resistant to instruction from any white person. Marcus had been separated from his family at age 10 and sold to a plantation where he endured brutal treatment for 6 years before emancipation. His intelligence was obvious, but his hostility toward authority figures created classroom disruptions that threatened his own educational progress and affected other students' ability to learn. Victoria's approach to working with Marcus required her to confront her own assumptions about discipline and authority while developing new skills for building trust with someone who had every reason to distrust her. The breakthrough came when she began sharing her own story of loss and transformation, helping Marcus understand that privilege did not protect people from suffering or guarantee that they possessed wisdom or strength. Their relationship evolved, from mutual suspicion to grudging respect, and eventually to something approaching mentorship. The progress that Victoria witnessed in her students provided daily evidence of human potential that slavery had systematically suppressed but never eliminated. Adults who had been forbidden to learn were mastering complex material with remarkable speed when given the opportunity. Children who had been told they were intellectually inferior were demonstrating academic abilities that surpassed those of white children from more privileged backgrounds. The transformation was so dramatic that Victoria began to understand education as a form of liberation that was almost as significant as the legal freedom that emancipation had provided. The school's impact extended beyond individual achievement to encompass community development and political organization. Evening meetings in the school building brought together formerly enslaved people to discuss issues ranging from labor rights to voting privileges. Victoria's presence at these gatherings provided her with insights into the sophisticated political thinking that was emerging from the black community as they organized to secure and protect their newly acquired freedom. The most significant test of Victoria's commitment came when she was offered an opportunity to leave Savannah and return to a more conventional life among white society. A distant relative in Charleston had learned of her circumstances and extended an invitation to live with his family while she sought a suitable marriage that would restore her social status. The offer represented a chance to escape the challenges and uncertainties of her current situation in favor of the familiar comforts of privilege and respectability. Victoria's decision about whether to accept this offer required her to choose between two fundamentally different visions of her future and identity. She could return to the world of inherited advantage, accepting a dependent role in someone else's household while seeking a husband who would provide financial security in exchange for her submission to traditional gender roles. Alternatively, she could remain in Savannah, continuing to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than social hierarchy, while contributing to a cause that transcended her personal interests. The choice was complicated by the fact that her work at the school, while meaningful, provided only basic subsistence rather than the material comfort she had known throughout her previous life. The physical demands of her current existence were considerable, and the social isolation from her racial and class background was sometimes overwhelming. The opportunity to return to a world where her birth and breeding were valued represented a temptation that was difficult to resist entirely. Victoria's ultimate decision was influenced by a conversation with an elderly student named Reverend Joshua Adams, who had been enslaved for 70 years before gaining his freedom. Reverend Adams possessed a wisdom about human nature and moral responsibility that challenged Victoria to consider the long-term consequences of her choices rather than their immediate benefits. He helped her understand that genuine freedom required the courage to choose principles over comfort, and that real security came from relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited privilege. The moment of final decision came during a community celebration marking the school's first anniversary, when Victoria was asked to speak about her experiences working with formerly enslaved students and teachers. Her address to the gathering would either affirm her commitment to the principles of equality and mutual respect that the school embodied, or reveal that her transformation had been superficial rather than genuine. Victoria's speech on that evening represented the complete abandonment of her previous identity as a plantation mistress and her full embrace of a new understanding of human worth and social responsibility. She spoke about the education she had received from her students and colleagues, acknowledging that they had taught her more about courage, dignity, and perseverance than she had learned during 26 years of privileged existence. Her words carried the conviction of someone who had discovered that genuine respect and meaningful work provided satisfactions that inherited wealth could never match. The response to Victoria's speech from the school community marked her complete acceptance as a member of a society based on merit rather than birth, cooperation rather than domination, and shared humanity rather than artificial hierarchy. The woman who had once bought and sold people had become someone whose worth was measured by her contributions to the common good rather than her ability to command others. The transformation was complete, but its ultimate test would come in the challenges that lay ahead for a community struggling to build a new world from the ruins of the old. 7 years after Victoria Hayes first witnessed Celeste remove her own shackles in the courtyard of Magnolia Creek, she stood at the podium of the Savannah City Council chambers, delivering testimony that would determine the fate of public education funding for the entire region. The irony was not lost on her that the woman who had once owned 300 human beings was now fighting to secure educational opportunities for their children and grandchildren. The packed chamber represented a cross-section of post-war Georgia society. Former slaves who had become property owners and business leaders, white allies who had embraced racial equality despite social pressure, skeptical politicians calculating electoral advantages, and hostile opponents who viewed any progress toward genuine integration as a threat to their vision of social order. Victoria's testimony that morning drew upon 7 years of experience managing the most successful integrated educational system in the South. The Savannah Educational Consortium, which had grown from a single warehouse school into a network of 17 institutions serving over 3,000 students, had become a model that other communities throughout the region were attempting to replicate. More importantly, it had produced measurable results that challenged every assumption about racial differences in intellectual capacity and academic achievement. The statistics that Victoria presented to the Council revealed transformations that would have seemed impossible during the slavery era. Black students who had entered the consortium's programs as illiterate adults were now serving as teachers, lawyers, doctors, and business owners throughout coastal Georgia. White students who had been educated alongside formerly enslaved children had developed perspectives on race and social responsibility that differed dramatically from those of their parents. The economic impact of these educational investments had generated prosperity that benefited the entire region, creating a practical argument for integration that transcended moral considerations. Victoria's presentation included detailed case studies of individual students whose achievements illustrated the broader patterns of success that the consortium had fostered. Marcus Thompson, the angry teenager who had initially resisted instruction from any white person, had completed law school and established a practice that specialized in civil rights cases. His recent victory in a federal court case that overturned discriminatory voting restrictions had secured political participation rights for thousands of black citizens throughout the state. Sarah Freeman had advanced from her initial role as a reading teacher to become the consortium's director of curriculum development, creating educational materials that were being adopted by schools throughout the South. Her textbooks addressed the specific challenges faced by students who were encountering formal education for the first time as adults, while also providing instruction in civics and constitutional law that prepared formerly enslaved people to exercise their rights as citizens. Dr. Eleanor Washington, who had begun her education at age 55 as a student in the consortium's basic literacy program, had completed medical training through a scholarship program that Victoria had helped establish with Northern philanthropists. Her clinic in Savannah's black community provided health care, services that had reduced infant mortality rates and increased life expectancy in ways that benefited the entire city's public health. The opposition to continued funding for integrated education came from a coalition of white supremacist organizations that had been gaining political influence throughout the South as federal reconstruction policies were gradually abandoned. Their representatives at the council meeting argued that racial integration would inevitably lead to social chaos and economic decline, citing inflammatory rhetoric about racial purity and natural hierarchy that echoed the justifications for slavery that Victoria had once accepted without question. Victoria's response to these arguments revealed the depth of her transformation from someone who had inherited prejudice to someone who had experienced the reality of human equality through daily interaction with people of diverse backgrounds. She addressed each racist stereotype with specific evidence from her work at the consortium, demonstrating that academic achievement, moral character, and civic responsibility were distributed among individuals regardless of their racial identity. Her words carried the authority of someone who had witnessed capabilities that racist ideology claimed were impossible. The most powerful moment in Victoria's testimony came when she acknowledged her own past as a slaveholder and described the process through which her understanding of human worth had been transformed. She spoke about the moral blindness that privilege had created, preventing her from recognizing the intelligence and dignity of people she had considered property. The honesty with which she discussed her previous beliefs created a credibility that allowed her current arguments to reach council. members who might have dismissed similar testimony from other sources. The personal costs of Victoria's advocacy for racial equality had been considerable over the 7 years since she had committed herself to this work. Her public stance had resulted in complete ostracism from the white social circles that had defined her early life. While death threats from extremist groups had forced her to employ bodyguards and vary her daily routines to avoid potential violence, the financial sacrifices had been substantial as well, as business leaders who opposed integration had withdrawn support from projects she endorsed. Despite these challenges, Victoria had found sources of support and community that provided deeper satisfaction than her privileged existence had ever offered. The relationships she had developed with students, teachers, and families connected to the consortium were based on shared commitment to principles rather than social advantage. The respect she had earned through her contributions to education and civil rights was more meaningful than the deference her inherited status had once commanded. The consortium's impact extended far beyond formal education to encompass community development initiatives that addressed the practical challenges of building an integrated society. Evening programs provided instruction in financial literacy, helping formerly enslaved people navigate banking systems and property ownership processes that had been completely unavailable to them under bondage. Legal education sessions prepared community members to understand their rights and responsibilities as citizens, while also training them to recognize and resist attempts to reimpose forms of racial subordination through discriminatory laws and practices. Victoria's role in coordinating these diverse programs had required her to develop administrative and leadership skills that went far beyond anything she had learned during her privileged upbringing. The practical experience of managing complex organizations, building coalitions among diverse groups, and securing funding from multiple sources had revealed capabilities that had been suppressed by her previous dependence on inherited wealth and enslaved labor. The work was demanding and sometimes overwhelming, but it provided purposes and satisfactions that her comfortable plantation existence had never offered. The consortium's teacher training programs had become particularly important as communities throughout the region sought to establish their own integrated schools. Victoria had worked with Celeste and other educational leaders to develop curricula that prepared instructors to work effectively with students from diverse backgrounds and educational experiences. These programs emphasized not just pedagogical techniques, but also the social and emotional skills necessary for building inclusive learning, environments where all students could thrive. The success of these teacher training initiatives had attracted attention from educational reformers throughout the United States, leading to invitations for consortium staff to consult with school systems in other regions. Victoria had traveled to cities from Boston to San Francisco, sharing strategies for creating integrated educational programs that produced superior academic outcomes while also fostering mutual understanding between racial groups. The most challenging aspect of expanding the consortium's influence was navigating the increasingly hostile political environment that was emerging as federal Reconstruction policies were dismantled. State legislatures throughout the South were enacting laws designed to restrict black political participation and reimpose racial segregation in public facilities. The gains that had been made during the immediate post-war period were being systematically eroded by organized campaigns that used both legal mechanisms and extra-legal violence to maintain white supremacy. Victoria's response to these challenges had evolved from educational work to direct political advocacy, as she recognized that sustainable progress required not just individual transformation, but also structural changes in laws and institutions. She had become a prominent voice in the coalition of civil rights organizations that were fighting to preserve the constitutional amendments that had secured freedom and citizenship for formerly enslaved people. The financial sustainability of the consortium's Programs had become an increasingly urgent concern as federal funding for reconstruction initiatives was reduced and private donors in the North turned their attention to other causes. Victoria had spent months developing alternative funding strategies that would allow the schools to continue operating without depending on sources that could be withdrawn due to political pressure or changing priorities. One of the most successful fundraising approaches had involved documenting the economic benefits that integrated education had produced for the entire Savannah community. Businesses owned by consortium graduates generated thousands of jobs and contributed significantly to local tax revenues. The improved literacy and numeracy skills of the workforce had attracted new industries to the region. Property values in integrated neighborhoods had increased rather than decreased, contradicting predictions that racial mixing would lead to economic decline. The consortium's medical training programs had addressed critical healthcare shortages that affected both black and white residents of rural Georgia. Dr. Eleanor Washington and other black physicians who had been educated through consortium scholarships were providing services in communities that had previously lacked adequate medical care. Their clinics had reduced the spread of infectious diseases that threatened public health regardless of racial boundaries. The legal education programs had similarly produced attorneys who were defending the rights of both black and white clients, while also providing services to poor communities that had been underserved by the existing legal system. Marcus Thompson's law practice had handled cases involving labor disputes, property rights, and family law issues that affected working-class families of all racial backgrounds. Victoria's testimony to the City Council concluded with a comprehensive vision for expanding integrated education throughout Georgia during the coming decade. She outlined specific proposals for establishing consortium-affiliated schools in rural areas where transportation challenges made attendance at existing facilities difficult. Advanced programs would be developed for students who had completed basic education and were ready for specialized training in fields like engineering, agriculture, and business management. The research initiatives that Victoria proposed would document the educational methods that had proven most effective for students from diverse backgrounds, creating knowledge that could benefit schools throughout the nation. Publishing programs would make consortium-developed textbooks and teaching materials available to educators who were working to create inclusive learning environments in their own communities. The Council's vote on continued funding for the consortium represented more than a decision about educational policy. It was a choice between competing visions of Georgia's future. The integrated approach that Victoria advocated would continue moving the state toward genuine equality and shared prosperity. The segregated alternative favored by white supremacist groups would recreate many of the inequalities and inefficiencies that had characterized the slavery era. The debate that followed Victoria's testimony revealed the depth of divisions within white society about racial relationships and social change. Progressive council members cited the consortium's documented successes as evidence that integration produced superior outcomes for all participants. Conservative members expressed concerns about social stability and the potential for political backlash. From white voters who opposed racial equality, the intervention that proved decisive came from an unexpected source. James Harrison Fletcher, the elderly son of Colonel James Harrison, who had liberated Magnolia Creek 7 years earlier, had returned to Savannah after completing his military service and establishing a successful business in Philadelphia. His testimony about the consortium's national reputation and its potential for attracting investment to Georgia provided economic arguments that transcended the racial considerations that had dominated previous discussions. Fletcher's presentation included letters from northern industrialists who were considering relocating manufacturing operations to regions with educated workforces and stable social conditions. The consortium's integrated schools had created exactly the type of environment that these businesses sought, offering skilled workers and progressive social policies that would attract the kind of families they wanted to employ. The council's decision to continue funding the consortium's programs represented a victory for the principles of equality and integration that Victoria had embraced since her transformation began 7 years earlier. More importantly, it demonstrated that practical arguments about economic development and social progress could sometimes overcome ideological resistance to racial equality. The celebration that followed the council vote brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the consortium's work during its 7 years of operation. Students who had learned to read as adults shared the podium with children who were preparing to attend college. Teachers who had been enslaved just years earlier received recognition alongside colleagues who had abandoned privileged backgrounds to join the cause of integrated education. Celeste's address to the celebration crowd focused on the continuing challenges that lay ahead. Despite the victory they were celebrating that evening, the political momentum that was building against civil rights throughout the South would require sustained organizing and advocacy to counter the economic pressures that were being applied to limit opportunities for black advancement would demand creative responses and alternative strategies. The relationship between Victoria and Celeste had continued to evolve over the 7 years since their initial collaboration, developing into a partnership that transcended their different backgrounds while acknowledging the complex history that connected them. Their professional collaboration in leading the consortium had been marked by mutual respect and shared commitment to educational excellence, while their personal friendship reflected an understanding of the moral transformation that both had experienced. Victoria's gratitude toward Celeste extended beyond appreciation for the practical assistance she had provided during the crisis at Magnolia Creek, to encompass recognition of the moral education that their relationship had made possible. Celeste had demonstrated through her own example that human worth was determined by character traits like intelligence, compassion, and integrity rather than social status or racial identity. The consortium's influence on social relationships throughout Savannah had created a model for the kind of integrated society that civil rights advocates envisioned for the entire South. Black and white families who had developed friendships through school activities were challenging segregation in other areas of community life. Business partnerships between people of different racial backgrounds were creating economic opportunities that benefited entire neighborhoods. The children who had been educated in integrated classrooms were developing perspectives on race and social relationships that differed dramatically from those of their parents. Their friendships crossed racial lines in ways that would have been impossible under slavery or segregation, creating the foundation for a generation that might finally overcome the prejudices that had divided Southern society for generations. Victoria's decision to dedicate her life to this work had required her to abandon not just the comfort of inherited privilege, but also conventional expectations about marriage and family that had defined women's roles in her social class. Her choice to remain unmarried and professionally committed represented a conscious decision to maintain her independence and continue contributing to causes that transcended personal interests. The community that had formed around the consortium provided Victoria with relationships that were more meaningful than the superficial friendships of her plantation days. The bonds that connected teachers, students, and supporters were based on shared commitment to principles and goals, rather than mutual advantage or social positioning. The diversity of backgrounds and experiences represented in the community created opportunities for learning and growth that homogeneous social circles could never provide. As the celebration concluded and participants began planning for the challenges ahead, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her from the privileged isolation of Magnolia Creek to the collaborative community that now defined her existence. The transformation had been painful and sometimes overwhelming, requiring her to abandon comfortable assumptions and develop capabilities she had never known she possessed. The process had also been profoundly liberating, freeing her from the artificial constraints of inherited status to discover forms of achievement and satisfaction that were based on genuine merit and contribution. The work of building an integrated society would continue to face obstacles and setbacks, but the foundation that had been established through education, political organization, and economic development provided hope that progress toward justice and equality would continue. The image that remained with Victoria from that evening was the sight of hundreds of people from diverse backgrounds working together towards shared goals that benefited everyone involved. The consortium had created more than educational opportunities. It had demonstrated that cooperation across racial lines was not just possible, but superior to the segregated alternatives that white supremacists advocated. The shackles that had once bound both women had been broken through. The hard work of genuine understanding and mutual respect. Celeste had achieved freedom not just from legal bondage, but from the limitations that society had tried to impose on her potential. Victoria had liberated herself from the golden chains of inherited prejudice to discover authentic dignity and purpose. Their story was far from finished, as the work of building a truly equitable society would require sustained effort across multiple generations. However, the transformation they had achieved together offered proof that human relationships based on equality and mutual respect were not just idealistic dreams but practical possibilities that could be realized through commitment, courage, and the willingness to see beyond artificial barriers to the shared humanity that connected all people. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.